welcome once again friends to this NPTEL module on international trade theory and empirics. We are on the last week in this particular module that is purely targeted to the understanding of trade and development, especially in this critical juncture where the world is facing, world is experimenting as well as trying to coming out of that COVID-19 pandemic. Now, so we have dealt so many things before all our lectures, but in this particular lecture we will highlight we will try our best to highlight the post COVID implications. But this is part of the last week module. We try to also understand what kind of positioning India had taken earlier, especially to protect its own country's boundaries in terms of international trade. So, the title of the lecture is targeted to clarify import substitution versus export orientation. Without further delay, let me just give you the backdrop of this particular strategy India adopted earlier. Now, so the first question comes to the mind is that why do countries grow more than others? What is the rationale behind? Is it only their structural or the resources availability that defines international trade? I think the factors and its specialization or any kind of relations to the growth model we have already discussed from the beginning of our modules. Now, we will also address what kind of strategy India took earlier in order to protect its domestic boundaries. Now, second question which is very essential to explain is that do their strategies regarding international trade have a role to play? Now, during the 1950s and 60s, especially for the developing countries, experience a decline in world markets for their primary products, and there has been a deterioration in terms of trade and growing deficits in their balance of payment. So, that was the concern in the very early phase of our independence. In Indian context as well, besides the developing countries experience. The next important point to be discussed as part of the strategy adopted for import substitutions and export orientation is that the developing countries had to choose between competing models of industrialization, that is import substitution versus and export promotion. Now, what are the genesis of this concept and discussion? It is the common terminology of import substitution and export promotion, sometimes very misleading. So, given the problems in the external accounts and the supposed advocacy of the import substitution strategy mentioned by Rolf Prebisch and Singer, that the countries should adopt IA strategy. Okay. So, during much of the late 20th century, a number of countries in the developing world pursued a policy of import substitution industrialization. That is why it is in short called ISI. The common ingredient was protective tariff afforded to domestic industry. So, in order to have import substitution installation, wherein the non-tariff barriers, the foreign investment, state ownership of assets, state regulations of private investment, etc., were also other ingredients to explain the import substitution industrialization. Some other rationale behind this ISI is that just before the economic reforms of 1992 in India, where India liberalized its functioning in terms of international trade, on-weighted average tariff rate in India was at over 100%, was probably the highest among large countries in the world, especially among the developing countries context. From the second half of the 19th century, the idea became known to economists and politicians that the tariff autonomy could be used to reinforce a process of industrialization. Late industrialization in the developing world therefore was characterized by diversity in the application of import substitution industrialization. The ISI that is import substitution installation evolved in two stages majorly. One is called emergent stage and is consolidation. So, we will discuss in between of our discussion that there are some direct benefits of import substitution mechanism that was adopted. So, those direct benefits are like this promotes initiation and growth of local industries. So, in our next slides we will discuss about local industry protection, that is infant industry protection. Actually, while discussing about the promotion of local industries, we will also emphasize that the restriction for the purpose of local industry, protecting local industry. This in fact generate a gap in the economy which calls for investment within domestic boundaries. So, IS protects infant industries against competing with well established international companies and markets. The restriction on imports that creates also increased demand for the products, local products. Now, coming to other benefits such as employment generation, this is due to the domestic industrialization. So, that will facilitate further employment. Now, it also reduces the cost of transportation from long distances to a confined home boundaries, and it also facilitates urbanization through the expansion of industries. Now, we have discussed around 7 points. Most importantly, it counts employment, it facilitates local products, it also reduces cost of transportation, it generates further demand to domestic products, and accordingly local industries are also gets enhanced. Also it facilitates urbanization through the expansion of local industries. Now, some anecdotal experiences, those written by some experts. We are also referring this document from other sources. So, like the one aspect we have already discussed about infant industry, it promotes infant industry, as I already mentioned. A case we are mentioning that how it is promoting. By German economists suggest, German economist and politician Friedrich List in 1841 suggests that it was perhaps the first to put German economist or politician Friedrich List was perhaps the first to put forward the infant industry argument for the developing countries. IS strategy is an attempt to replace commodities that are being imported, usually manufactured and consumer goods, with domestic sources of production and supply. This is typically a strategy that is first to erect tariff barriers or quotas on certain important commodities. Then it will try to set up a local industry to produce these goods. Now, although initial cost increases because we are not promoting the international competitors into it. So, the cost since raw materials and others might be restricted. So, that may raise eventually higher cost and that leads to large eventually this leads to large scale production and lowers the cost. Hence, less dependence will be on external economy and it improves balance of payment. So, this also generates external economies in the form of learning by doing at the early stage of establishment. So, that is why we are saying infant stage of establishments. Now, by saying so, we cannot avoid some risk of import substitutions, like some risk like maybe you count it as disadvantages. Risk are such as it may create some lack of external competition that affect the efficiency of the infant domestic industries. Hence, this would negatively affect growth, that is one of the flip side of import substitution. So, restrictions such as physical import licenses, guarantee deposits, tariff walls would hinder trading across nations. There are failures to meet consumer demands also by the growing domestic industries that may result in the development of black markets. Now, it cannot avoid the financial leakages which occur in reducing the government revenue and the overall capital base of the economy. So, the trade protection that is due to the IS may lead to overhauled exchange rates that cause a rise in domestic prices. It forces government to spend more to subsidize industrial investment. This causes high budget deficits, and some example to support this argument that occurred in Sri Lanka during 1960 and 1970s. Okay. So, inflation may take place, there are evidences of inflation took place in different part of the countries, different places which has gone through the IS strategy. So, inflation takes place causing exports to be less competitive. Small size domestic market may not exploit the economies of scale from the home production. To cite an example for this is Brazilian economy, where Brazil abandoned the use of IS on computers in the 1990s as the policy was a failure. The presence of polarized internal income distribution, the ownership of the means of production will be monopolistic, creating an extended gap between the rich and poor. Developing countries bearing a few are characterized by predominance of agriculture. That is also another aspect to be looked upon. So, there is a large amount of surplus labor in these developing economies because of predominance in the agriculture sector. So, that could be tapped correctly, but if you are not promoting international competition, that may not explore the utilization of this surplus labor. On the other hand, there also exists shortage of capital to carry out various investment programs. Furthermore, low income elasticity of demand for agricultural commodity restricts demand both for internal and external markets. Now, to count a few further often another side of this lecture is export orientation. We have already discussed what is called import substitution industrialization technique. Now, export orientation should also be simultaneously followed, and India adopted as well. Refers to the policy of the government that offers encouragement to the exporters to enhance the exports of the country is called export orientation. India's exports saw a rising trend since 1970-71 continuously. It is observed that India's export after devaluation year, mainly from that year of 1968-69, increased to a considerable extent and diversified at the same time. So, India diversified as well as India also increased its extent of export. So, export promotion measures were taken in the 80s. Those include incentive schemes to promote exports, which was launched and provided for imports of raw materials, machinery, capital equipment and accessories against exports. This scheme was also called replacement, replenishment scheme, which was later replaced by exim scrip scheme. Now, in the last couple of minutes in this particular module, we will be confining our discussion to clarify there are some phases of import substitution strategies, and those phases we are dividing into three, that is those are called early phases, middle phases and latest early phases. So, or the latest phases. So, in the early phases, as we already pointed out that devaluation rupee was there and it was devaluated by 36.5% in gold in 1965. Government expressed hope for expansion of export earning because of Indian goods would be cheaper in international market during that time. So, the first early phase lasted around 73. So, we count it till 1972-73 as the last chapter of the early phase. Then in the middle phase we start counting from the 73 onwards, and it continued up to a decade from there. And so, but the import substitution could not bring viability in the change to the balance of payment progress. So, balance of payment rather came to a major halt, and that has called for a a major structural change during 90s, early 90s. So, government overtook steps to increase exports, then export promotions were adopted. In the latest early phase, we are counting the 90s, beginning of the phases where major steps were taken to correct the balance of payment crisis, and later on government went for suggested for the liberalization of its country. From then that day onwards, I think we are going by again in 95 onwards, we have been attached with the WTO list, though we are the founding members of WTO. Then many restrictions are avoided, and that promoted international competition. This phase, though we are exporting, we are going by export promotion as well as we have some import restrictions, but through a regulated channels that has helped the country to correct BOP as well as progress in many directions through the international trade. So, these are all the discussions so far for understanding import substitutions and export promotion strategy. I think we will carry forward the discussion for the next class is on implications of international trade, especially overcoming some challenges, how the East Asian crisis has turned to a miracle. That is why it was called East Asian miracle. We will take off in the next class for sure. With this, let me stop here. Thank you.